This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
And if you say something like, the Son is like the Father, which isn't untrue, we would say that. In fact, Scripture says that. But if we say only that, and we don't make the argument that he's the same being as the Father, then we could conceivably allow for tritheism or Arianism, possibly to justify its presence in our churches.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host, James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well. Looking forward to our conversation on a first-order doctrine.
Yes, those of us in the United States are thinking about a big anniversary in 2026 of our nation's founding, but there is a big anniversary for Christians in 2025, which relates to the Council of Nicaea, which was held in 325 AD. And so we want to talk just for a few minutes today about the Council of Nicaea, what led up to it, what its significance was, what were some of the key features of this conference and the outcome of it and the significance of it for today. So, James, I want to start out with this question. What was it that led to the Council of Nicaea? Now, I know there's a long answer. There's a several centuries answer behind that. But in broad brushstrokes, what was it that made the Council of Nicaea necessary?
Heresy.
All right.
That's my one-word answer.
But of course, the heresy was a specific kind of heresy, and it was widespread because of specific teachers. So what were the specific issues at play, and why had it risen to the level? There's heresy today, in the church, in various branches of the church, and yet this rose to a different level.
Yeah, it's the heresy really came to a boiling point in Alexandria, Egypt. Remember that after the last great persecution in the first decade of the 4th century, Constantine has his victory, and there's the Edict of Milan that finally gives peace to Christians in the empire, returns their properties to them. And in a certain way, you could stand back and say they actually now have a little bit of time and liberty to really dig in theologically. The persecutions have ended. And in Alexandria, maybe the intellectual center of the Roman world is Alexandria. The great library is there. You have highly intellectual Christians, Jews, and pagans all working in that city. And in that city was a popular preacher named Arius, a presbyter, who accused his bishop Alexander, not named after the city, I guess, but Alexander of Alexandria, of teaching heresy, or error at least, because Alexander had indicated that the Father and the Son, the Divine Father and Divine Son, are the same God, or the same ousia, is the language that was used for being, that there's one being that is God, and the Father and Son are the same being. And Arius thought that he detected a whiff of modalism, or what we call Sabellianism, which was a Trinitarian heresy from the previous century, that had argued that there was no real distinction between the persons in the Godhead, but the Father is the Son, is the Spirit, and really Son and Spirit are just external revelations of what underneath is really just one person. So it was an anti-Trinity. It was the original kind of anti-Trinitarian heresy. And Arius himself had actually written against modalism or Sabellianism prior to his own troubles. And so I think we have to remember this about heretics. Heretics usually become heretics as they are vociferously opposing other heresies. And so heretics they're not like a band or a coalition of the aggrieved that all band together against the Orthodox. Usually some of the most acidic kind of infighting is between the heretics themselves, and we have to understand him as an anti-modalist, which is we should be too. But then when he hears his bishop say that they're the same ousia, he suspects that perhaps he's collapsing the persons into each other, and he accuses his bishop of teaching falsely. So that then raises questions, though.
Yes, it raises questions because, it should also be added that both of them revered Origen of Alexandria, and both of them were reading Origen in slightly different ways, and that's probably due to Origen's lack of clarity.
I was going to say, I kind of blame Origen for that.
No, I would agree, but Origen looms large over this whole discussion. But nonetheless, they both are going to cite Origen. But Arius, in reaction to this, because he detects what he thinks might be modalism in Alexander, Arius goes far in the other direction with his own heretical teachings.
And what I want to say is that didn't come from nowhere. There is a little bit of even in some statements by Origen, but in others as well, like in Justin Martyr and even a couple comments in Tertullian, definitely men that we don't brand as heretics. And I would not want to set them up as proto-Arians. But nevertheless, they did have what we could identify as a subordinationist tendency in their understanding of the relation of the Father and Son. So that they would say things like the Son doesn't know the Father the way the Father knows himself. I mean, Arius says that, but that was being said by non-heretics, just people that were wrong or misspeaking, even before Arius was speaking that way. So the idea then would be that the Father has a knowledge that is greater than the Son's, in which case then the Son's mind would have to be in some respect inferior to the Father's.
Origen uses illustrations of the relations within the Godhead, like the Father is the Son, and the Son, S-O-N, is like the rays coming out, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a kind of priority, inferiority sort of relationship there, where it's not just a relationship of origin, not origin, but origin, not just a relationship of begetting, but it's a relationship in which the Father has more than the Son has. And even after, so to speak, even though he believes in eternal generation, but even the Son as generated still doesn't quite have what the Father has. Now, there are other passages in Origen where you could make the case that he's saying they're co-equal. This is what makes it confusing with Origen.
Right.
But I think for instance, in Justin Martyr, when he talks about the generation of the Son, how he's distinct from the Father, he says that the Son he argues against something like what we would call natural generation, and he argues that the Father generated the Son, his words, by power and will. Obviously, the difficulty with that is that's how God creates a world, by power and will. And so what is the difference between the generation of the Son and, say, like the generation of the created order? And if the mechanism that distinguishes the Father and Son is exactly the same as the mechanism that distinguishes God and the world, then maybe the Son, and I'm just going to kind of get into Arius's head here if I can a little bit. Maybe the Son is just like the first created thing, given that his relationship to the Father, the mechanism for it's the same as the creation's relationship to the Father.
So this is where Arius goes. Arius goes in the direction of saying that the Son is essentially, I mean, to put it as kind of crassly as we can, essentially a created being who is who was begotten by the Father, but in time. Famously says there was when he was not.
Yeah, and that's his Achilles heel.
Yes.
That little phrase, that was the one that really sunk him, because Origen had actually said, you cannot say there was when he was not. I mean, and so he really gets sideways of some of the better portions of Origen when he speaks that way. But it also then leads him to say that he is the first creature. And then he carries it out to its logical implications. He is not co-eternal. I mean, in his letter Thalia that he wrote to Alexander, he makes that explicit. I think there's another, and at the risk of being too pointy-headed, but I'll run that risk anyway. There's another Alexandrian stream of influence on Arius, which is pagan. I'm not saying that to say that makes it wrong. Sometimes pagan philosophers say the right thing, and we should agree with them. You and I have discussed that in episodes in the past. But in this case, there's a contemporary of Origen in the city of Alexandria, the great pagan Plotinus. And Plotinus's cosmology, his view of sort of how the structures of the world are ordered all the way up to the first cause, is one in which the absolute source of being, which he calls the one, is not the immediate cause of the visible world. It's actually mediated through a series of demiurgic, kind of semi-divine, semi-demigod sort of beings that sort of flow out of the one. But there's a sense in which the one is so supreme, so superior, because Plotinus, the pagan, believes that he is simple and immutable and all these sorts of things that other Christians also believe. But he thinks that because of that, God, truly God, whatever true God means, he cannot be the immediate creator of the mutable, material, temporal, multi-parted world. Otherwise, that would entangle him in all those sort of undivine-like qualities. And so the demiurges kind of run interference, so to speak, between the source of the world, the first cause of the world, but the one is not a creator for him. It's interesting that Arius sort of takes that on board, but then plugs Christian, kind of slathers Christian idiom on top of it. And the way that Arius thinks of the Son is very similar to the way that the pagan Plotinus thinks of the Logos as a kind of less than fully God emanation that sort of takes over the creating, but the one God doesn't create. For Arius, though, he understands that if that's how the Son functions, then we need to draw a creator-creature distinction between the Father and the Son themselves. He doesn't accept the emanation doctrine exactly. He thinks that anything not God must be created. But if the Son isn't truly God, then he must be created. But then Arius says, but then in turn, he sort of turns around and creates all the stuff below him in the scale of being. And I don't know. I get why I mean, he's wrong, but he is looking at Bible verses that clearly indicate the Son created.
Right. And that's something also to be noted about heresy in general that we can learn from this whole Nicene episode, which is that heretics have Bible verses, and they often have Bible verses that on the surface, just atomistically read, have a kind of that can sound compelling.
Yeah, you can read Jesus saying the Father is greater than I.
Right.
You can read verses that indicate createdness in the Son. Now, we would say that's according to his assumed nature. He assumes a created nature into personal union with himself in the incarnation. And so that's where the Orthodox would interpret those verses. But Arius still can kind of move from verses like that to concluding that the Son as such is created, not just the Son as incarnated, but the Son as such, as Son, is created. And he works that out. And that really, when he accuses his bishop of perhaps being a Sabellian, the question then comes back on him. Well, then exactly what do you, Arius, think is the distinction between the Father and the Son? And when he's pressed, he concludes that the Son is not co-eternal with the Father, not of one and the same substance as the Father, and that in fact he's the first and most wonderful creature of God.
So Constantine is ruling the Roman Empire at this time, sympathetic to Christianity, would identifies himself as a Christian, and therefore is giving extreme weight to the things that the bishops are concerned about. And this is brewing in Alexandria. Alexandria is the intellectual center of the Roman world and really of the Christian world. And Arius is a very effective orator by all accounts, has a significant public following, and what he ends up preaching and teaching is that the Son is the highest created being and is not eternal.
Arius also has a lot of friends, and these were friends from his school days. They had all studied together as young men under the same mentor, and that camaraderie. I mean, he he called in the markers, so to speak, on that camaraderie when he got himself into theological trouble. And these men weren't just presbyters. Some of these men were bishops, and so he had cover from well-placed friends in the empire. I also think when Constantine, I mean, Jonathan, you teach church history, and we're doing a very short podcast here, but when this thing broke out in Alexandria, this debate, it was settled in good order in Alexandria because Alexander didn't just kind of ham-fistedly come down on top of Arius. He convened a council of over 100 North African bishops. I mean, that's a huge, I mean, that's almost the first ecumenical council. Not quite. I mean, Nicaea really is, but it's a huge council of bishops. And the Syrian bishops were not pleased with what the Egyptian bishops decided, which was that Arius was a heretic and could no longer go on preaching in Alexandria. But by that time, I think he was already out of the city. He had already gone to seek refuge with friends. But Constantine, at that point, had no jurisdiction in Alexandria because he was still only the emperor in the West. And all of this was happening under, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, the Eastern Emperor.
Yes.
That he defeated in 324.
Right.
And so in 324, he's now the sole emperor of East and West, and now he's got to deal with all this trouble in the East, which is now his trouble. And initially, he just sends these letters telling everybody to knock it off, and this is just striving at words. That's what he initially thinks, and his ambassador, Hosius of Cordoba, takes the letters, and what he finds out is that that's just not going to settle the debate. And probably Hosius is the one who tells Constantine, you're going to actually have to get everybody in the same room and see this thing right through to the end. And I think that's probably the impetus behind convening everyone at Nicaea.
So all these bishops are convened by the emperor, who, as you say, at this point now has control over both the western half of the Roman Empire and the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And they're convened in Nicaea, a city in what would be modern-day Turkey. So sort of in the middle between East and West, in terms of the Roman Empire, but an appropriate place for this meeting, and not a small undertaking in these days to get everyone together. But he does, and he himself is a part of the proceedings. There's a great account from Eusebius of Constantine entering the Council of Nicaea, and everyone stands up, and he made his way through the midst of the assembly looking like some heavenly angel of God, covered in a garment which glittered as if it were radiant with light, reflecting the glow of his purple robe, adorned with the brilliant splendor of gold and precious stones. And so Constantine is very much a part of the whole council, at least by his presence. And we have records of occasions where he weighs in, although he's not making the main arguments.
I think that also, I think you and I could both agree that in some ways that can cast a little bit of a shadow over the proceedings, because it puts a political impetus into the conclusion that you subscribe to, that in a pure situation would not be there. And of course, there's going to be great debates all down through the history of the church with regard to Erastianism. Do bishops answer to emperors and kings, or do kings answer to bishops and presbyters? And there's really the question of sort of realms of authority. But at this point, to put it crassly, if you want to keep your job, you need to make that guy happy.
Right.
That's not everything. And I do think that there were actually men who were willing to make him unhappy if they thought he was theologically wrong. In fact, Athanasius himself, who was at the council, not yet Bishop of Alexandria, he would become so 3 years later. But he is willing, when Constantine gets a little wobbly several years later under the influence of his sister, when he becomes sort of shaky in his commitment to the conclusions of Nicene, Athanasius is willing to pay the price politically. So I don't want to suggest that they were all just sort of groveling at the feet of the emperor, but it does kind of put his thumb on the scale in terms of, if you're going to walk out of this council and still have your job, you're going to need to side with the conclusions favored by the emperor.
Right. So he is very much there. He casts a long shadow. What's the conclusion of the Council of Nicaea in 325? And we should say at this point that the Nicene Creed, which is recited by many Christians, perhaps on a weekly basis, that creed that is recited is an expansion, a later expansion on the 325 formulation, but the 325 formulation that comes out of this first Council of Nicaea forms the basis for it. So there's not a substantive change. The later one doesn't undermine the earlier one. It just expands on the earlier one. So what does the earlier one conclude?
There are a couple things. First of all, decisively against Arius.
Yes.
And the anti-Arianism of the creed most strikingly is in the statement that the begotten Son of God, the only begotten Son of God, is God of God, light of light. But then their phrase, very God of very God, or true God of true God, really making the argument that he's not a kind of godlike creature, sort of God, but with a qualification. The way that, for instance, the Bible might call magistrates or angels Elohim, it's not a kind of honorific title. It's really, truly, essentially divine. And then, of course, their most contentious and maybe most important load-bearing word, that he is homoousios,
right,
with the Father, that
right.
he's of the same being as the Father. Now,
right.
that word is going to be debated for the next half century, in part because there's still some. Greek doesn't have a nice, clean distinction between person and nature language at this point. And sometimes hypostasis, which really would translate substance if you were translating it quite literally into Latin, substantia, hypostasis sometimes refers to nature or being. Sometimes it might refer to what we call person. But ousia could kind of function in the same way. When I say I was talking to a human being, what I mean is the person Jonathan, even though I'm using being language. But there's a certain sense in which personhood is something more than human being, because I'm a human being, but I'm not Jonathan. Therefore, your person isn't my person, but we're the same kind of being. So how does being person language relate? There were probably some people who had misgivings about homoousia or homoousios who were not necessarily Arians, even though they were suspected of being such. They were just waiting for a little bit of clarification with regard to the words and the concepts. But why not just pick a different word? I mean, if we're going to debate that word, couldn't we settle on a different word? I think the conclusion is that was the right word. Because, and as troublesome as that word was, we needed a troublesome word. We needed the kind of word where Arians or cryptic Arians could not, as it were, sneak into the shadows and make their way back into the churches. And if you say something like, the Son is like the Father, which some favored saying that, if you say the Son is like the Father, which isn't untrue, we would say that. In fact, Scripture says that. But if we say only that, and we don't make the argument that he's the same being as the Father, then we could conceivably allow for tritheism or Arianism possibly to justify its presence in our churches.
So homoousios of the Father, God of God, light of light, very God of very God. And then at the end, there is appended, although this isn't part of the proper confession, but they append some anathemas or some, things that they rule out. Those who say there was a time when he was not, and he was not before he was made, and he was made out of nothing, and he is of another substance or essence, where the Son of God is created or changeable or alterable, they are condemned by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So as if homoousios were not clear enough, God of God, light of light, also they add those things at the end, which definitively says Arianism is out.
Yeah, and I think and there are other things by implication. I mean, you and I have talked about creeds, and we're on the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals podcast here. We believe in creed. We believe in the importance of creeds and confessions. And what is really remarkable about this confession is just how many heresies are checked at the door and forbidden entrance into the Christian church, not explicitly, but implicitly. And I think that's what a good creed will do. A good creed will positively state orthodoxy such that a myriad of false teachings are sort of slain in one paragraph. And I think this has, obviously it's anti-Arian, but it's also anti-Sabellian. It's also anti-tritheistic, which wasn't really an issue at the time. But when it became an issue in the 6th century, the Nicene Creed was actually equipped to rule that out.
So this carries a lot of freight. It is a definitive statement. As you say, and we don't have time to get into all this, but as you say, over the next half century, there are still debates largely related to the definition of homoousios or ousia. What do we mean by that? So it's not settled. All the details aren't settled, but in a definitive way, the Arian question is settled, and this serves the church down to this day.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think the Nicene Creed, as this year we celebrate the 1700th anniversary, is also serving us in other ways. It's not simply ensuring that we don't all become, Jehovah's Witnesses, kind of modern Arians. It's also ruling out the option of like Mormonism, for instance, which is polytheistic. I think it also, rightly understood as intended, it also rules out some versions of what is called social Trinitarianism, which is a kind of trendy way of trying to rehabilitate the Trinity, but really it has soft tritheistic implications about it. But the Nicene Creed really is still inoculating us from so many bad tendencies that we might have in understanding the one God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
All right, James, I want to do a hard pivot here because you are, in a very short time, going to be participating in a conference sponsored by the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals with our friend Fred Sanders on this issue. So just give our listeners a brief overview of that conference in case they are able to join you and Fred at that time.
6 sessions. I'll do 3. Dr. Sanders will do 3. Friday night and Saturday in Sacramento, California, the Sacramento Gospel Conference 2025. And my first session will be what I'm calling stumbling toward Nicaea. And really what I want to get at is that this notion of the Son as in some respect inferior to the Father, leading to Arius's conclusion that he's not very God of very God, is something that was already going on for 150 years before Arius showed up on the scene. So what I want to do is make the argument that there is a kind of unfortunate trajectory that somewhat makes sense of Arius. It's not that he was sitting there one day and thought, Jesus isn't really God. So in other words, that came from somewhere. I want to talk a little bit about that as well. I will also do, Lord willing, a session on the Father's immediate creation of the world. I think this is part of the anti-Arian strategy that is often overlooked, but it's actually the first line of the Creed. When the Creed confesses God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, that itself is anti-Arian because Arius thinks the Father only created one thing, which is the Son. So a kind of rehabilitation of the immediate creatorhood of God, that the mediatorialship of the Son is with regard to his incarnation and with regard to the reconciliation of sinners, but that we should really pull back from the notion of the Son as the mediator of creation. That is certainly not how the 4th century fathers would have thought of it. And then I'll also do a session on homoousios and the importance of that term and the misunderstandings of that term in the 4th century, but why we really need to maintain it now. Dr. Sanders has some sessions. He'll also do one that I'm looking forward to, which is on the sort of the aftermath of Nicaea, what happened over the next half century, because the gains, while it's a great achievement, it really needed to be defended and then expanded at Constantinople in 381. And so he's going to narrate some of that 4th century debate for us and a couple other sessions as well. So glad for anyone on the West Coast who can join us.
Well, you can find out more information on that at alliancenet.org. And I believe, is there a page, James, for the Sacramento Gospel Conference as well? So that you could just search that and find details of how to register for that upcoming conference. And For those of you who are interested in thinking more about the Trinity, we have a few copies of Scott Swain's little book, The Trinity, an Introduction. And it is an excellent book that introduces many of these same themes and even references some of the things that happened and were decided at the Council of Nicaea. That's published by Crossway. You can register for the chance to win that at placefortruth.org or at theologyonthego.org. And so we'd urge you to do that if you are at all interested. For all of you listening, we thank you. If you know someone who might be helped by this podcast, please pass it along. If you can rate and review the podcast, that just takes a minute, but it really helps us spread the word. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. There are donate buttons on both of those websites. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.